Welcome to the Politics Guys. I'm Michael Baranowski, a political scientist at Northern Kentucky University. Before we get started with today's show, I wanted to mention that this is the first episode of the now nonprofit Politics Guys podcast. So, Jay, there's not going to be any more of that. Hold that thought for just a second so we can talk about, men's grooming products or something like that.
We're not shilling for the man anymore.
No, we are not. And, we really want to thank everyone.
But I have to say, I really do like Dollar Shave Club.
Yeah,
seriously.
Absolutely. Without a
but
doubt.
No, yes.
But anyway, we do want to thank everyone who made it possible for us to get to where we are today. And, I think we're fairly excited about what's in store, and we really hope you'll keep on, listening, commenting, and supporting us as we sort of leave the advertisers behind and, kind of put it all in your hands. So thank you very much. All right. We were going to start the show with a look at the budget deal, and we'll still talk about that. But before we do that, I thought we'd briefly discuss something that happened, after we decided on our stories for the week, which we do midday Friday usually. Late on Friday, it was announced that President Trump would not be releasing the Democratic response to the Nunes memo alleging FBI, misconduct, or at the very least, I guess you could say, extreme sloppiness related to a FISA warrant application that was obtained in connection with the Russia investigation. Now, the administration cited security concerns that were raised both by Deputy Attorney General Rosenstein and FBI Director Wray. Now, many Democrats, of course, were quick to point out that the administration seemed entirely comfortable ignoring these concerns raised by the FBI and Department of Justice when they decided to release the Republican Nunes memo, though to be fair, the president did direct the Justice Department to work with Congress so that the Democratic response could be made public. And so I'm sort of withholding judgment here. I want to see what happens and if this memo comes out within the next few days, in which case maybe that seems possibly reasonable to me, especially since I think there's a distinction to be made here that my understanding is that when it came to the Republican memo, the concern that the FBI and the DOJ raised were about incomplete and misleading information, which seemed to me to be a pretty good concern. But here it seems much more like a security concern with actually the information that's being released. And I think that might be an important distinction. So like I said, I'm sort of withholding my judgment on this. Jay, any thoughts?
Yeah, no, I think, not to just pat myself on the back, but I think I sort of predicted this last week. If I am Adam Schiff and I am preparing the Democrat response memo, and I am playing sort of a Machiavellian game, which is what these folks do, I would load that memo up with every bit of top secret intelligence I possibly can, in order to sort of force this result so that the president could not okay it. I think it will be released eventually, but it'll go back and get scrubbed. And I think, as we both said, the Republican memo, there wasn't anything in there that would seem to compromise any sort of methods or sources or any of that sort of intelligence information. As always, when we're talking about these kind of intelligence stories and stuff, because we don't know what we don't know. So this my sense is, with classified stuff, I'll just spin this out there. I mean, it's one thing to say, Kim Jong-un had cornflakes for breakfast this morning, and you say, okay, that's top secret, that's classified, and some people say, well, why? What does it matter? If you think for just 3 seconds, it matters because someone who had, so it's sort of like that. I mean, sometimes there's information which in itself is innocuous, but can point to a source or a method, something like that is not. And that's why you have to scrub it. So
yeah, and I in the name not just of and partly in the name of consistency, when it came to the Republican memo, I thought that the opinions of the FBI and the Department of Justice should be very seriously considered in this. I mean, and so I feel like I'm being consistent in this. Though a couple things I want to.
And again, their opinion wasn't don't release; it was supplement. So
yeah, the couple things I want to mention, before we move on to our next story is number one, the Republican memo, the Intelligence Committee voted on a party line vote to release that. Whereas the Democratic response, actually, that was a unanimous vote on the committee to release that. I think that's important to point out. But secondly, I really feel like, and I say this a lot, the Trump administration mishandled this whole thing. I
Really?
would, yeah,
That the hell you say?
I would think in a more, I know, in a more competent administration, what would have happened would have been the president would have sent his people to the committee and said, listen, it would make a lot more sense and it would look a whole lot better if these two memos were released together and we had all this worked out. So let's get the FBI, the Department of Justice, someone from the White House, and the committee together, and let's coordinate stuff so everything can come out at the same time and this doesn't become this looks like this horribly partisan circus sort of thing. That to me would have been the competent way to handle this, but obviously that wasn't the way that this was handled.
It's my perennial lament here. I think that Republicans are terrible, or tend to be terrible, at this inside baseball part of the game, for a whole lot of different reasons. And
you said that before, and I know I disagree with you. It kind of sounds like, well, if only Republicans were sneaky like Democrats.
Yeah. Gotten better. Well, look, I mean, if we don't talk about sort of, again, the sneakiness and Machiavellian sort of tactics, then I think we're not being honest. We're not being real.
Yeah, I just disagree that Democrats are somehow sneakier and more Machiavellian. I think that's I think there's parity. See, I think you're totally wrong about that. But anyway, I understand
your side a compliment.
you having marinated in the right wing media where you would think that. But anyway, there was obviously there was a lot of discussion about the memo, and of course we talked about this in our last episode. And there was one listener in particular who responded with one of the most in-depth comments I think we've ever seen on the comment section. I can't read the whole thing. It would take a while, but I really feel like excerpts of it that I can kind of fairly characterize the comment, and it very much relates to what we've just been talking about. And so I just wanted to throw that in.
Without revealing sources or methods.
Yeah, exactly. Well, we can't say it's Brian, and so you can actually read the entire comment on if you go to the website and look for episode 135. But I think it's important to bring this up. So anyway, here we go. Brian writes, the idea that gave life to this podcast and it acts as the mission statement for each episode is profoundly admirable. I like the way this started. The belief that two people of disparate yeah, you don't have to worry about that, right? But anyway, he goes on to say that this promise is what frequently makes it so frustrating as a listener when the show fails in this stated goal. He said, this will be interpreted perhaps as bias, but I honestly believe that Mike strives to uphold his end of the debate, as evidenced by how often I'm surprised by his perspective, but all too frequently Jay disingenuously does not, proved by how predictable I now find his opinions on most every issue.
Why?
And then,
we go again.
No, it's not just, I don't throw this in because I want to attack Jay here, but moving on, he says, hearing him get incensed about the contents of the Nunes memo, for example, hearing him repeatedly try to bait Mike into admitting some sense of shock and outrage at the supposedly suspect actions of the FBI reads as ludicrously hypocritical for someone who, every time details of potential collusion between the Trump campaign and Russia come out, has argued that it is wrong-headed and improper to talk about the investigation while it is still in motion. So and he goes on kind of along those lines. But Jay, I wanted to get your thoughts on that. Basically, essentially saying that you, and I think Republicans, a lot of folks on the left are saying this as well, that Republicans are being sort of oftentimes intellectually dishonest or inconsistent in this. And in the case of you, obviously, he's saying that, well, how can you say let the investigation play out when it's a Trump-Russia thing, but if it's the Nunes memo and accusations of misconduct against the FBI, you're much more ready to reach a conclusion before the investigation ends. At least that's what I took it to be. So I wanted to get your response to that.
Well, I think, and we can address this because you and I have talked about this sort of off the air, just in how we want to handle some of these stories, is that we don't want to be reporting on the rumor or the innuendo or here's a story from an unnamed source that says X, Y, Z. but we will report and respond on stories when something actually happens. For example, a witness appears before a committee and gives testimony. Or in this case, a memo comes out and says, here are findings, whether they're preliminary findings or not. So, I mean, my sense is that, look, I haven't seen, and we haven't seen any findings thus far to support a collusion claim. I mean, there's been discussions, there's been the innuendos, there's been the convictions for things that are other than collusions. I mean, for not convictions, indictments for money laundering. One, I guess, taken a plea, but we haven't seen those findings of here is the collusion. So that's why I've said let's withhold judgment on that till we see something. Perhaps we'll see something like that in this Democrat memo. I don't think we will, because this is focused more on the FISA process. But maybe there's some other piece of evidence in there that would indicate that there's some sort of collusion. And again, we've had folks like Adam Schiff who have been out there saying there's a strong case, but we haven't actually seen those facts yet. And again, by collusion, it's let's define what we're talking about. We're talking about Trump or the Trump campaign working with agents of a foreign government to help him secure the presidency through some sort of illegal manner. And I haven't, that's so to me that's why we haven't discussed that. And again, we held off on discussing the FBI and the FISA case until the memo was issued and there was an actual sort of anchor to hold on to here.
All right. Hey, I think that would, based on that standard, then that seems like it's a consistent position. If I hear you correctly, you're saying that you'll comment on public documents that are part of the process that are released, but not on rumors and innuendos. And in basically in that you feel like you've been consistent throughout.
Right.
Okay.
Right. And I think your position is the same on that too. I mean, we're not going to talk about whatever
innuendo and rumor. Yeah.
Closest, again, sources familiar with the subject say. Sure. But if somebody shows up before Congress and raises their hand and testifies, that's something different.
Yeah. All right. Anything else on this, Jay, before we move on?
I don't think so.
Okay.
Well, there will be more.
There certainly will. Yeah, absolutely. Well, the story we were going to open with this week was, what plenty of people on both sides of the aisle, Rand Paul and Nancy Pelosi accepted, see as a positive development. Late this week, large bipartisan majorities agreed to a budget. Now, the measure passed the House in a 240 to 186 vote. With the Senate,
and just to interrupt,
go ahead.
I believe there was going to be a song involved.
We'll talk about that in a minute, actually.
Okay.
Now, the Senate approved it 71 to 28. Now, in the House, 73 Democrats voted for the measure, which more than made up for the 67 Republicans who voted against it. And of those 28 no votes in the Senate, 16 came from Republicans and 12 came from Democrats. So this is truly, bipartisan. And President Trump quickly signed this legislation, but technically, it's not the budget. It's actually a continuing resolution that funds the government through March 23rd. And the only reason that was done was to give staff more time to actually, write the thing, fill in the details. But unless something deeply weird happens before then, this is pretty much a done deal. And that's why what Jay was referring to, for those folks who don't know, is I said I was so supremely confident there wouldn't be an actual budget signed by the time we recorded the show, that if that happened and I was wrong, then I would sing a song of my own composition entitled "Donald Trump is Great." And so I was saved by a technicality, but it's still, if you check the wording of what I said in Facebook, I'm okay. Anyway, I
think it's sort of a mixed blessing of the one of you having to admit you were incorrect and sort of also us being saved by your singing this song. But,
I don't know. It might be really good. Well,
it probably comes out a wash.
Yeah, probably. Anyway, so what this budget does is, number one, it busts the caps on both defense and non-defense spending that Congress put in place back in 2011. And it adds around, $500 billion in spending over the next couple of years, which is what led to those really strong objections from the House Freedom Caucus, as well as a number of Republican senators, particularly Kentucky's Rand Paul, who managed to slow things down enough both to, really annoy his colleagues and to actually cause a 5-hour government shutdown. Now on the House side, Minority Leader Nancy Pelosi staged an 8-hour, well, not exactly a filibuster, but
You can't call it a
yeah,
filibuster if it's in the House, really, I don't
exactly.
think.
So she just used her prerogative as Democratic leader to hold the floor, essentially. And she came out against the bill because it didn't include any action on Dreamers, which is a key issue for many in the Democratic base, of course. But in the end, well, she wasn't able to convince enough of her colleagues to withhold their votes. And now I should also point out this budget takes another contentious issue off the table until 2019, and that's the annual vote to raise the debt ceiling, which, in the past few years, the Freedom Caucus in particular has attempted to use as leverage to get spending cuts. So
Right.
I think that pretty much hits the summary. Jay, what do you think about this deal?
Well, this is again setting aside the what I think, but I think this is one of the reasons why many conservatives have said for going on so many years now, Trump is not really conservative. This is a lot of money that's being thrown out there. Look, I see this as see, there I go again. It's sort of a mixed bag, though. The good news is, yes, there was some bipartisan progress. Bad news is it's a lot of spending. Um, but Republicans live to fight another day. I think if you're looking at the policy thing of this, I'd say not so great, just because we're busting spending caps. We're spending more money than we have. Republicans are in some respects betraying the idea of being the party of frugality. Um, from a political standpoint, tactical standpoint, I think it's a Republican win. In that the whole Nancy Pelosi episode sort of came for naught, and sowed some dissension in her caucus, and making this a more difficult vote than it had to be for some Democrats. And I think the good thing is the extending the debt ceiling. If you recall, the government shutdown brinksmanship we were playing a couple years ago and during the Obama administration dealt with the debt ceiling, and a government shutdown is one thing, and you and I think have agreed that in most cases government shutdowns are it's sort of a little bit of a circus and a big photo op sort of event, but they are in the end more or less benign. Missing a debt payment on the debt or missing the debt ceiling, that is not. So I think, look, the markets, most everyone should be happy that debt ceiling piece has been moved down the road. I get where conservative Republicans come from, in that was a key piece of leverage, because it was sort of almost a nuclear brinksmanship type move. But so Pelosi ended up with really nothing.
I
And
disagree.
okay,
I
what do you think she
disagree
got?
because I think she knew it was going to pass. I don't think she thought that she'd get the votes, but what she did is she played to her base, a very vocal part of her base, and I think that was important for her to do for symbolic reasons now. So I think she got something from that, and sometimes in politics you do things that aren't
Sure.
going anywhere. Just so I think she got that. But also I think I
No,
disagree with.
I would agree that makes sense. The playing the base and maybe defends some members from a primary.
Yeah. Yeah. And I also agree. Well, Rand Paul's a funny guy. I disagree with him vehemently on some things, but I gotta say, I admire his. He feels to me like a truly principled guy who sometimes I think is just absolutely wacko. But
Yeah.
and there was something that one of my favorite, perhaps my favorite conservative writer is Jonah Goldberg, who writes in National Review. He's funny, he's perceptive, he's wrong a lot, but he's so worth reading. And what he wrote about this, I think, is worth retelling, at least in part. He said, regardless of Paul's political calculations, his arguments were entirely right. If you passionately insisted that runaway deficit spending was an abomination under Barack Obama, there really is no way you can defend the same thing under Donald Trump. And he went on to write, not only does this budget blow up any pretense of ideological consistency, there isn't even a coherent economic theory behind it. Borrowing and spending more when the economy is doing well violates not only Keynesianism, but traditional conservatism. And I think Jonah Goldberg is exactly right on this. Jay?
Amen.
Yeah, well,
I'm
there you
no,
go.
I'm a big fan of Jonah Goldberg, and I'd say he usually gets it right. Um, the piece I think where Democrats lost on this is that by the Pelosi speech and by trying to protect some incumbents and tying this to Dreamers and immigration, um, they've painted their party into a little bit of a corner, as being, look, that their party is sort of a one issue party. So I think that's what some moderate Democrats were trying to avoid, because look, there's going to be in the next several weeks, and I believe the Senate has committed to starting debates on some sort of broader immigration reform, which would include some relief for the Dreamers, most likely coupled by some greater border security, and who knows what on the issues of the lottery and chain migration, or as you like to call it, family reunification.
Which is what the actual term is, but go ahead.
Well,
Yeah. I mean, that's what the term is, but if you want to make
no
up
one
your own
split
word for it.
How did the families get split apart, though?
All I'm
Right?
saying is that you want to use your
Because
term that I
someone
understand.
volunteered. It's not as if they were, somehow split apart by the U.S. government. It's one person decided they were going to
No,
move.
I'm just using the official term, and you're using the Republican talking point
The
term. That's
the
okay.
unofficial. Okay.
Anyway, but
Regardless, there will be a discussion on both those terms, which was something that had been committed to beforehand, and I think there will be some, and the Democrats will be in a tough spot there, uh, because look, I think they're going to be willing to sacrifice the Dreamers in order to score points on these other immigration pieces, which are less popular with the American people.
yeah, I want to move away a little bit from the. I'm never really all that comfortable with the who wins, who loses political kind of point making thing. But I want to move away and talk a little bit about the actual budget that was agreed to. A couple points I want to make about that. Number one, our current national debt is around $20 trillion, which is that's a lot of trillions. And according to Congressional Budget Office projections, just interest payments on the debt will be $307 billion in 2018. And if current trends continue, a decade from now, they'll be $818 billion. And the debt as a percentage of our GDP is currently right around 106%. Now, and a lot of Republicans were really pushing to more money for the military, right? That was a big thing.
Sure.
And if you take a look at the military spending, the United States spends 36% of all world military spending. In 2016, we spent $611 billion. Number two, an incredibly distant number two was China at $215 billion, and an incredibly distant number three was Russia at $69.2 billion. And my point about this for a
Although I'm a
long
little
time,
curious how we know all those numbers.
well, fine,
Because
question
I'm,
numbers.
yeah.
Let's say this, Jay. Maybe you can agree to this, maybe not. I don't know, but it is essentially incontrovertible that the United States spends far, far more on the military than any other country.
No, geez, I'll contradict you on that maybe.
Well,
Well,
it's
let's put it
wrong.
this way. Look, are we in the
Okay.
top? Are we in the top three? And have we historically been in the top three since World War II?
Top
Yes,
three?
absolutely.
No, Jay. No. We spend way, way more. We spend more than the next seven countries combined. I mean, this is fairly, there's no real disagreement about people who study this thing. We spend a ton more on the military than anyone else. And there's just no question about this. I mean, all the data shows this. There's
We
no
got the and we got the.
serious,
My question is the data sources. But
you know,
dear,
I,
dear Vladimir, how much are you spending on your military?
that's
Oh, I've
not,
got it right here. So you
not
know,
how
so
it
I have
works,
to give it
Jay.
to you.
But okay, fine. So you just want to question the data source. You're wrong. That's fine. You're
No,
wrong a
look, I'm
lot.
agreeing in principle that we spend a tremendous amount on the military,
Yeah,
more the most of any Western country.
the most of anyone. The most of anyone. Yeah. Anyway, the point being is that I think we spend way too much on the military. There are every year there are plenty of programs that, in fact, analysts and even people at the Pentagon say, we don't actually need this weapon system. It doesn't make sense. And Congress says, oh, no, we really think you need it because they see it as a jobs program, essentially, which is, not exactly the best kind of jobs program. So there's a lot of this stuff. And, I've been studying this for decades now, actually. God, I'm getting old. And so to me, this is, a great opportunity to think about what our commitment should be, what the right size for our military should be. And, if people are willing to force all this austerity on domestic programs, and I think in some cases, maybe that makes sense, I think we should force some of this austerity on military programs. And because most of this military spending isn't on things like, for instance, propping up our still pretty bad veterans medical system, taking care of people who served, taking care of the troops, essentially. It's for these weapon systems, these oftentimes hugely cost overrun white elephant weapon systems. And that's where I think we need to really focus. All right. You have anything else on the budget before we move on?
No, no. Other than again, I don't think we're in disagreement that this is a lot of spending. That government spending is often misplaced, wasteful. And it's unfortunate that it's not a little little more felt budget. But yeah, other than that, I mean, I don't disagree with you on the military spending. Is some of these things misplaced? Absolutely. So
Okay. Well, Jay, we've talked about gerrymandering in the past, but mostly when we've talked about it, it's been in terms of court cases that are challenging, district design, right?
right.
But this week, there was actually some big news in this area that doesn't involve a legal challenge in our very own state of Ohio, where the legislature passed a bipartisan redistricting plan with, well, no opposition in the state Senate and only 10 no votes to 83 votes approving it in the state's lower chamber. And it's kind of interesting, the history of this. The plan came together thanks in part to pressure by a group called Fair Districts Equals Fair Elections, which was working toward putting its own initiative on the ballot this fall. And the legislature didn't want that, understandably so. They wanted control of this. And so the measure that they passed still keeps redistricting within the legislature, but new maps would require the approval of 3/5 of lawmakers, including half of the minority party. And now there are various fallback provisions if the legislature can't reach agreement. And all of these, though, would require significant minority party approval to move forward. Though in the event that everything falls apart, the majority party can still draw its own map, but it would only last for 4 years instead of the usual 10. But even that map can't unduly favor one party, excessively split counties or cities, or draw non-compact districts. And this is a first in the nation process, and if voters approve it in May, it could potentially shake things up in Ohio's 16 congressional districts. Now, according to the efficiency gap criteria, which measures votes that are wasted due to gerrymandering, Ohio has a gap that results in between 2 to 3 extra Republican seats. And currently, 12 of Ohio's 16 House districts are held by Republicans. So, Jay, I wanted to get your take on this. I think it's I'm a big fan of this. I think the Ohio legislature got together, did the right thing in the spirit of bipartisanship. This is something that the governor wanted to see happen, and I'm really proud of my state here, and I hope this could be kind of a model for so many of the other states that don't do it this way, because the vast majority of states don't have a process like this, and I think it's great. What do you think, Jay?
Yeah, as am I, proud of my state. And actually, I think, Mike, I'm going to be working to try to get some of the principals of the folks who were in these discussions to come on the show for an interview.
Oh, that'd be great.
In the coming weeks. And also, look, I think there's a really great, and I'll reference this in the one I'm reading, analysis of how this breaks down. And it goes to, this is a districting and redistricting is a really tricky process. I don't think a lot of people appreciate all of the intricacies that go into it, because it isn't simply, okay, we want this Republican, we want more Republican seats than Democrat seats. Okay, that's a part of it. there are wheels within wheels within wheels as when these discussions go on. There are factors that when you talk about making the districts compact and contiguous, reckoning that with also some of the federal overlay about majority minority districts that make things difficult. And there are personalities involved. So it's a incredibly intricate process, and there's a really great article that we'll post from someone who's a veteran Ohio political observer. I should also say I think that the Ohio redistricting new map is not perfect. If you look at it, my district is what has been referred to, and I woke up this morning and I thought I had thought of this myself, and then I read things and other people had already made this up, but the snake on the lake. Um, which is my congressional district, which again is if you look at the map, you'll see it. It is the one that runs just along the beach of Lake Erie from Chagrin Falls, Ohio, all the way to Toledo. And it is certainly odd, and it is strange that, for example, my congressional representative lives like 2.5 hours away. But setting that aside, I think the general impression is it's always going to be imperfect, and there are always going to be one party favored over another. There is always going to be politics involved in this decision, and I think that's okay. And I tried to make that point a couple weeks ago, as having this resolved through a political process rather than a judicial process. And we're going to talk in a minute of sort of what happens when you try to resolve it through a judicial process. So yeah, I think this is a great step forward for the state of Ohio. We could have a really great talk on how these things are figured out in the districts, and what favors, for example, sometimes I just think the numbers that people use for proxies are incorrect. For example, saying that Trump won 52% of Ohio's vote there, but Republicans control 75% seats. I don't think those two match up, because I think there are a lot of Democrats who voted for Trump, a lot of Republicans who didn't, and so forth. But that's a discussion for another day. But I will say, go Buckeyes.
All right, yeah. Well, let's hope let's hope the voters approve it and that it becomes a model for more states. So, before we get to our next story, we'd like to thank our newest supporters. First, an extremely generous PayPal contribution from Judy, who writes, "Go Jay." There you go.
Yeah, that's hi, Mom. Yeah.
Now, we have a second very generous PayPal contribution from a listener who said we didn't need to mention her name on the show, but she wrote a great message, and I don't think she'll mind if I share that, so I'm going to do that. She writes, "This one's for Jay. Putting it out there and taking the burn for the cause. Love you guys. I continue to learn so much from all of you. Keep it up."
Thank you. And that was one from who wasn't my mom. So yeah.
Exactly. Not a relative at all, as far as I know.
But I understand your need to remain anonymous.
Well, that's why I wanted to, we had a listener who kind of took a shot at you earlier on, and I kind of wanted to balance that out. But anyway, finally, we'd like to thank Spencer, our latest continuing monthly supporter through Patreon. He writes, "Hi, guys. I'm very happy I finally stopped spending all my loose change on beer long enough to contribute to your podcast. I've been an avid listener since the previous primary voting season, and occasional listener even longer than that. Your work deserves some compensation from me for all I've enjoyed and learned from you guys. Mike and Jay remind me of my brother and father, respectively, med student and then lawyer, funny enough. And Trey is cut from the same cloth as me as far as entertainment media, fiscal stance, and plenty of other similarities. Your show keeps me up to date on political news, but also helps me retain some semblance of my sanity at the same time." It's nice to hear. "I also wanted to give a thank you shout out for your social media presence and response time. I appreciate providers who take the time to actually interact and have a little fun with their audience. It's a shame Mike won't be singing odes to the Donald for us, but maybe something like that will come down the pipe soon enough. Keep up the great work, and all the best to you and yours." There we go. So thank you, Spencer. So Jay, it looks like your fans kind of came out in force this week, And I was thinking maybe we should do like a Team Jay, Team Mike contribution thing. But then I thought, wait a second, probably not a good idea for me, right? Because you and your fellow plutocrats there would probably just
Exactly.
overwhelm my side, like you do in the real world of
Exactly.
politics,
The
basically.
Koch brothers are going to weigh in and
You
drop
know.
a couple billion
Yeah.
on this. I
So maybe,
anticipate.
yeah. Anyway, so everyone, now that we're ad-free, listener support, of course, is what keeps us going. So if you'd like to join all of our great Politics Guys supporters, just go to politicsguys.com and click on either the Patreon or PayPal links. So, Jay, as you mentioned, another big gerrymandering story this week. The U.S. Supreme Court denied a request from Pennsylvania Republicans to intervene in a Pennsylvania State Supreme Court decision that ordered the redrawing of a congressional district that Pennsylvania Supreme Court said clearly, plainly, and palpably violated Pennsylvania's state constitution. And when that state's 16.2% efficiency gap favoring Republicans in 2016 was actually the sixth largest in the country. And in 2012, that gap was number one in the country, again in favor of Republicans. And at present, Republicans hold 13 of the state's 18 congressional seats. Now, I should point out that unlike the Supreme Court and, with other federal judges, Pennsylvania's judges are elected in partisan contests where they serve 10-year terms, and after that they run in a retention election, which doesn't have an opponent. Jay, first, I was hoping to get your thoughts about the Supreme Court, decision not to intervene. And then maybe I thought it'd be worthwhile to talk a little bit about judicial elections or the lack thereof and how
Yeah.
they might affect things. So what do you think about this? Well, the decision not to get involved.
Well, I think the decision not to get involved, given the other cases that are pending before it or on their way to the Supreme Court, I think that was probably appropriate. This is sort of a state problem, and they will let the state work it out. I think that's reasonable. I do want to say though that Pennsylvania, and this is another example of why redistricting is so difficult. And one reason why I think it ought to be kept from the hands of judges is the geography of Pennsylvania is much different than the geography of Ohio. We're neighboring states. The old joke about Pennsylvania is that there's Philadelphia in the east, and Pittsburgh in the west, and West Virginia in between. Pennsylvania has that sort of situation, whereas has two big urban centers and then a lot of rural space in between. So making up a map just because the Democrat power is concentrated in the cities um, is much more difficult in some place like Pennsylvania than it is in Ohio, where you have let's say three major urban centers: Cleveland, Cincinnati, and Columbus, and then a bunch of sort of mid-sized cities, Dayton's, Akron's, Youngstown's, and so forth. So that presents the challenge, and your friends at 538, I think, did a good job of showing all the different maps of how Pennsylvania could be drawn. And the other irony is that most of the maps do not look that different than the map that was struck down.
Yeah, and I should point out, I want to point out a point of agreement with you on this, in that the fact that Democrats tend to cluster in big cities does have an effect, which means that, and you mentioned this in an earlier story, that's saying that, well, President Trump won X percent of the vote, or, Hillary Clinton didn't, so therefore this number of, members of Congress should be represented, that sort of thing. That is overly simplistic and inaccurate. And that's why political scientists spent a lot of time trying to come up with a measure that corrected that, that took this into account, because you can't do those simple things. And that's what they're arguing this efficiency gap measure actually does, and so it's not as simplistic. And that, in fact, is what they argued before the Supreme Court in the earlier case. And this, sometime early this summer, I'm sure we'll hear from the court whether or not they accept this reasoning. But for right now, we don't know.
Yeah.
And also, go ahead.
Go ahead.
I said also I wanted to point out that I agree with you in terms of, the Supreme Court historically doesn't like to tell state judges what their own state constitution means. They tend to leave that to the state, and that to me is the important distinction here. Is when the case revolves around the United States Constitution, well, that's one thing, but this case, revolved entirely around Pennsylvania Supreme Court's interpretation of their own state's constitution. And I think rightly then the Supreme Court shouldn't get involved. And I would say the same thing whether it was a Republican or a Democrat bringing that case.
Yeah, three cheers for federalism there. Yes.
Absolutely. So, but what about that second thing? I was actually surprised at, and I did a little research into judicial selection after this, right? Because this vote broke down in the Pennsylvania Supreme Court along partisan lines, and in fact, Pennsylvania judges they run as Democrats or Republicans. They're not nonpartisan elections, and then they serve for these 10-year terms. And I was wondering what you thought about that sort of stuff. Ohio setup's a little different. I believe the elections are nonpartisan, but they serve for 6 years.
Right.
So, how much of that you've had a lot more direct interaction with the state judicial system than I have. So, how much do you think that weighs in how these decisions are made?
This is a tough question, a tough question to answer on a Saturday morning to try to, because we could have not only a whole show about this, we could have a whole series of shows going back and forth. There are advantages and disadvantages between appointed and elected judges, and it's really a lot of pros and cons, and I'll run through some of them. The typical idea is that an appointed judge will be more independent. They are not concerned about the politics or the views of the public as those may move back and forth. The impression is typically that an appointed judge is also appointed solely on the basis of merit, rather than perhaps they have a good political name that helps them get elected. That said, the appointment of judges, just as redistricting, is a political process. So it's impossible to take politics completely out of it. And I know there are a lot of groups that have worked hard and done a good job to improve the merit-based selection piece that goes into systems where you have elected judges. But the difficulty is, again, no one is really apolitical when it comes down to it. And then again, I say that as that's sort of what the founding fathers would have said. Exactly, that you can't trust your own instincts. So it's important, I think, therefore, that there is some relief valve for someone to be removed. And again, judicial elections are an imperfect tool for that, but it's the only tool we've come up with yet. Different states do it different ways, as you pointed out. Ohio has a straight election, but 6-year terms. I think some states have purely appointed systems. Some states have what's called the Missouri system, which is sort of what Pennsylvania seems to be a variation on, which is election and then sort of retention election.
Right. Which I think the idea there is with those long terms and not having to run against an opponent, that gives you a lot more, I would say, probably independence in that sense.
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
But yeah, it really is a fascinating topic. I'm sure, of course, Jay, that some people have suggested maybe there should be some sort of at least term limits for the Supreme Court. 20 years is often thrown out there. And I think you're right. It would really be sort of fascinating to do a special show on, an entire episode on judicial selection and how that affects things. And I actually know a couple of people who specialize in research on that. So maybe we should make that happen.
Yeah. And the other, again, having someone who works with a lot of state judges and federal judges, look, there are some absolutely fantastic elected judges. So I don't want to sort of denigrate that. If the implication is, well, if you're elected, you're a political hack. I don't think that's the case at all. And again, some appointed judges are better than others. You can see this in the evidence of one of the Trump appointees who recently withdrew. This was probably 2 months ago, when she couldn't or he couldn't answer basic questions about what certain motions were for, about civil procedure. So this is one of these things where there's no easy answer, but I am sticking with my answer that because there's no easy answer to redistricting, and there's no easy answer to this judicial appointment or election question. Redistricting ought to be kept as a political process and not as part of a judicial process. And I hope the Supreme Court says that later on. But
All right. Well, it is time for what we're reading, where we, take a step back and sort of talk about maybe some longer, more in-depth, thoughtful things that we're reading, or sometimes in my case, listening to podcasts or watching. So, my a couple things. I have actually some books this week to recommend. One is called Naked Money by a guy named Charles Whelan. I used this book in my economic policy class. We just finished kind of covering it. And it's really it's you might think that, economic policy and sort of a book about money sounds kind of dull, but he is one of the most engaging writers, and he in this book he does all kinds of things like explains why the gold standard is a horrible idea, which in fact actually convinced a number of my students who were formerly like, Ron Paulish sort of, we need to be on a gold standard type people. It talks about our trade relationship with China, how exchange rates and currency manipulation works, what central banks do, all kinds of other stuff. And it's really easy to understand. He does a better job than pretty much anyone I've ever seen to make economic policy understandable and yes, believe it or not, actually really interesting, a ton of great examples. So I would highly recommend this to folks. It is, I think, a really great, fun book if you're interested at all in economic policy.
Okay.
And Jay, what do you have this week?
Mine too are maybe a little bit more on the micro level. But going to this redistricting question, I would say two things. One, there was a piece by a guy named Tom Suddies in the Cleveland Plain Dealer, and Tom is he's actually a friend, someone I've known and worked with. He is certainly not of the same political cloth as I am. But he is probably one of the most insightful political analysts I've ever met. He gets it. He gets what's going on. And he has a great piece on how the Ohio district redistricting bill came about. And again, shows some of the wheels within wheels within wheels that operate in this kind of policymaking. And then as sort of a companion piece to that, I would recommend there was a piece in a publication called penlive.com, which I'm usually not familiar with, but I just found this in prepping for the show and looking up details on the Pennsylvania situation. They've got a great, very lengthy discussion about the Pennsylvania redistricting and the issues and the problems. And again, it's a great compare and contrast. Brings out some of these geographic, demographic issues in Pennsylvania that make it a little tougher than Ohio, and also the Supreme Court thing, and also that walks through sort of the various 538 iterations of here's how maps could look, and what works better and what doesn't. But it's a great sort of deep dive. Again, we usually try to go with the big picture overview on what we're reading, but this is more the deep dive on redistricting. So
cool, sounds great. And of course, all of this will be in the show notes. I should also mention since our final kind of Nunes sort of memo thing, my blog this week is I called it Malice, Incompetence, and the Trump-Russia Saga. It's sort of my take on the whole Trump-Russia story, and it features a cast of thousands, including Howard Baker, Napoleon, Richard Nixon, Bill Clinton, and maybe even a few other people. I threw all kinds of stuff in there, the kitchen sink.
And George Papadopoulos.
There, I don't know.
The hapless George
I should
Papadopoulos,
actually put him in there. Yeah, but if you're interested in reading that, of course, that's always at politicsguys.com/Mike. So, all right, well, there you go. That does it for this week's show, this Saturday show. We hope you liked what you heard. Listener support, more important than ever to us. Now more than ever. Did I say that right? Yes, I think so. Anyway, if you'd like to help us out, go to politicsguys.com and click on the Patreon or PayPal links. And if you want to support the show without spending anything, you can share this episode with your friends, followers, pass along our new show posts and tweets on Facebook and Twitter. Also, leaving reviews and ratings on the show on iTunes also helps, and as does subscribing to the show. That kind of gives us our metrics, as you will, if you will, and sort of gets us a sense of our audience size. So, and if you want to get in touch with us, well, you know how to do that, right? I bet. Mail at politicsguys.com. And there's our Facebook page, facebook.com/politicsguys page. We're also on Twitter at politicsguys. The executive producers of the Politics Guys are Michael Baranowski, Jay Carson, Trey Orndorff, and Bruce Johnson. Today's show was produced by Michael Baranowski. We'll be back with a new show on Wednesday. We hope you'll join us. Donald Trump is great. I do not equivocate. He's so insanely Great.